Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Just a very brief introduction, because I know you've got lots of the information sent out in advance. My name's Heather Probert. I'm a therapy lead in cardiac rehab at Harefield Hospital, so we're northwest London geographically. Thank you for the invite to talk today. It started as an article that we'd actually published in our professional magazine. So there's Chartered Society of Physiotherapy was doing an awful lot about placements, because for when we're looking at the educating the future workforce, there's a lot of placement lack in the current system due to COVID, and that's something which I'll pick up on as we go later on. So that was put onto Twitter, and a member of HPMA saw that and asked us to have a chat about it more from the blended learning approach, really. I'm going to try and make it as relevant to everyone as possible, because I'm probably on the other side of the fence to most of you, that I'm more of a clinician, though we do have a large role in educating our future workforce. And certainly some of the information I've heard from the previous speakers today has given me lots of ideas going forwards as well. So these are a couple of our students that finished very recently, and we're going to hear from one of them later as well, because we thought it would be really nice just to give you the students' view as well as to these placements that we've created. So I'm not going to focus in depth. We all know what was happening last year. A lot of press out there with regard to the health service, with regard to COVID, changing death rates daily. Vaccination was on every news channel you looked at. The impact on healthcare, patients waiting, health inequalities, so much that we saw last year. And initially, we never thought we'd manage to get through it. But in actual fact, when we look back over the last year, similar to what Will was saying about hitting pause and then reevaluating, we hadn't really stopped to think until I started to pull this together. But in actual fact, we've achieved so much over the last year, and I think lots of the things actually that have happened have actually been for the benefit of patients, our students, and the offerings we have for patients, really. The innovations that have come through, obviously lots of things went digital, which is something we've been talking about today, because initially obviously learning had to not be face to face. It was the same with our patient care. My service that I lead, we were 100% face to face up until last March, and 11th of March we were told all face to face had to stop. So we had to redesign our whole service overnight, really, and it's changed numerous times as we've changed with regards to more digital activity. We've been able to reintroduce face-to-face. We're really lucky we could have face-to-face since last July with our patients. Lots of rehab centres still aren't currently, so we are really lucky on that front. And it's also meant we can bring our students back in, but we've got quite a blended approach, really, because we've still got all the rules about social distancing. We've got rules about how many clinicians per workspace, the number of clinicians associating with patients. So lots of the things we've learned, which was a lot of trial and error and patient feedback and student feedback, we have adapted. So if I show you initially the differences between our placement, and firstly, I think this probably says it all, really. Before COVID hit, students were on site with us all of their clinical hours. Very much that was the only option that was offered. We probably should have thought of different options previously, as I've heard mentioned a few times today, but it worked well enough. We stuck with that. But now, if we look at the variants we have for these students, they get much more of an inclusive placement, and lots of them find that through different aspects of the service, they learn better. So some students very much like the hands-on activity with patients, and we've had to adapt that and be less hands-on with our patients just for their safety and ours. We run lots of different exercise classes that were all face-to-face, and now we have classes in the community, we have classes in our hospital, we have exercise classes on MS Teams. So some of my team are like the Joe Wicks of the cardiac rehab world, and we've got so many more options, which is beneficial for the staff, the patients, and most importantly, the students as well. So they spend time on, let me just skip back. They spend time on site with us, they're face-to-face in the community. They also spend lots of their time on Microsoft Teams with us and also with patients. And also we've adapted some of the other aspects of the placement. So beforehand, the students came in on that first morning, they followed us room to room. wherever you were, you turn around, they're right behind you. They were very dependent, and it was quite difficult when they're on site to get them that little bit more independent, thinking for themselves. They'd sort of wait to be told to do things. And even some of our sort of like students that ended up getting first at the end of the placement, it was sort of something that we're thinking about, how do we change? At the end of their placement, they do a presentation to us that we'd probably heard multiple times before, because we wanted them to practice their presentation skills. And much of the education was very much in lecture format, so we were given the information probably that they'd had very similar at university. So there's a lot of things that we actually changed for the better in this sort of placement model. So at the moment, as I said, they spend time face to face, and also they spend time virtually. They're a lot more independent. They have to manage their time better. They have to sort of go between face-to-face activity, time online, so doing Microsoft Teams group work with patients, one-to-one, anything that can be done virtually is, because we have a very small office in patient space. It's difficult enough to fit my own team in there, let alone the students, but it's really important we make them feel as included as possible. So we spend a lot of time doing their teaching, objective setting with one-to-one reviews online, just to free up office space really, the same as my team have to as well. We've had to get them all set up with remote IT access, and accessibility of IT has been mentioned so many times today, and that's something I'm going to return to when we're looking at sort of like the benefits and the challenges of this new way of working. We've also changed the project, so rather than them presenting on a topic which we've probably heard multiple times, they're now doing much more meaningful projects. It started because we needed them out of the office for half a day a week, so we could actually fit other clinicians in doing clinical work. But now with the project work, they work well amongst themselves as students, interaction with us. They're doing more service evaluations, and with it being so much more practical, we really are finding they benefit much more from that than they do reading their textbooks, looking at lecture notes and just putting a presentation together. As a result of that, in actual fact, 2 of the service evaluations were put forward to a national conference, May time, I believe it was, and 1 was accepted as a poster presentation, 1 as an oral abstract. So now there's 5 students between those 2 projects are actually qualifying with a poster presentation or oral abstract to their name, which obviously for them is much more advantageous when they're entering the working world, because there's obviously a lot of competition there. The learning we've changed as well, we've made it much more active, which is I've heard echoed earlier. So rather than us sit there for an hour talking to them about cardiac medications or ECGs and then probably drifting off or thinking I've heard this before or not really comprehending it, we've got the presentations they review in advance and ask them to look at their lecture notes. We set some task work based on that, so it's much more active. It may be for the ECGs, it's analysing ECGs. For medications, it's questions about the medications, what they do, the benefits, side effects. Some of them it's case studies, so some case studies they look through and they work together between the students. So we've had 2 or 3 students, they're working amongst their peers, and then we'll do the team session afterwards, which is more of a general question and answers, clarifying what they've not understood, maybe chatting through some more case studies just to make it much more real life for them, and reviewing any sort of project work they've done. And we find they seem to put it much more into practice after that, looking at it from a practical point of view, than they did when we were just sat there feeding them the information. So that aspect of the change has been really beneficial, we've noticed. With regards to benefits, there's been an awful lot more. There's sort of, some people really get on with digital world, don't they, and others do struggle, which I've heard people mention, particularly Will earlier. The students' IT skills far supersede any of ours, definitely. So for my department's team, it's been very beneficial. I'm working with a workforce who came into their jobs because they're very practical people. We led exercise classes. It was very much active and on the go. And now much of the work they did actively spent sort of over computer links doing their initial assessments and talking to patients. And then less of the time is spent sort of doing the actual physical aspect of the job. So lots of my team have really struggled with that. And we have sort of had to make adaptations. And unfortunately, because all departments in the hospital are facing the exact same struggles, it has been quite challenging to get support from other areas to help the team with that. So I've had to do lots of sort of education over Teams, just so my teams actually understand how all these different systems are working. For the students, setting up remote access. If everyone that needed remote access phoned IT, the helpline would sort of crash. So lots of that we're having to take on that role, which is really quite challenging. We've not really had the training in it ourselves, and we just sort of learned till we've gone, really. Sort of people coming back from redeployment and then sort of finding themselves in a virtual world, which is quite challenging, and trying to sort of support students when they're going through this journey as well, so they get as much out of the placement as they did previously. Obviously, the service evaluations, having the students do much more active projects has been invaluable. They've had the benefit of obviously improving their CV when it's been sent off for different conferences. We've generated so much data over COVID. It was myself and one of my team that remained with the team throughout for March, whereas lots of the staff had to send off and help other areas that were struggling, obviously ITU being the main one, family support lines. There was lots of relatives that couldn't visit wanting regular updates. So lots of data was collected. We just didn't have the time to look at, and by actually involving the students in that analysis, it's actually been analysed, because if it was down to my team, it would still be sat there, because we're still trying to innovate and make changes to improve things for the students, but also for the patients that we're sort of looking after. So we've actually got this, we're much sort of further ahead than we would have been, and it's actually been more beneficial for the students to do that than, as I said, just the presentation. It's actually helped us to increase capacity as well, because one of the biggest problems we're facing, which is being echoed when talking about face-to-face sort of learning, is you can only have so many people per space, and that's one of the biggest challenges, sort of having people on site that need to be there and doing things in different way. And so far this year, well, I think if not even the year, the first student we took was in November because of massive redeployment, having the staff to support students. And already we were 100% over capacity on the students we took pre-COVID. So it really has made a difference that we can help the students, which one of the biggest problems is actually student placements at the minute, which we'll sort of touch on under challenges. So lots and lots of benefits. The students that we've seen, not obviously some of the students, the first couple of students were more hand-picked, that were sort of really interested in sort of cardiovascular care, whilst we sort of found our confidence, because we wanted to make sure they had a good placement as possible, as we sort of were sort of adapting as we went, really. But even further students who aren't necessarily interested in the area, they're sort of placed wherever there's a gap, and at the minute there's such a lack of placements. Even some of sort of the students who before would probably have struggled in the face-to-face placement really have found, because we're doing the education in a different way, the hands-on, the sort of support they're having through all members of the team, do seem to be sort of thriving much more than previously, where things were a lot more passive. They've now got to check the timetable, see which link they're coming on to, plan with the staff in advance to meet and discuss the patients, whereas before they followed you around room to room and it was a lot more passive. So that's something definitely that's been very advantageous. And it's also given us so many more options. I think it was Will that was saying that with the webinars, much bigger target audience were reached. Well, with our students, there were some students that couldn't come into a clinical area because there was shielding. So obviously having options that are virtual, although we like the blended approach with the face-to-face and also having sort of the virtual aspect and the sort of leadership project work, we can switch it to entirely virtual if required. So we've had a couple of students that had to self-isolate. They could continue unaffected throughout their placement and didn't miss out because of that, which is obviously really important. We had also a student who, he couldn't do a placement during COVID because the student placements were paid during COVID because it was deemed there was risk of death in service. When that sort of ceased, then the international students could actually restart placements because they weren't sort of eligible to be paid for placements. So what we found is one of the students had to wait for a good few months extra in the UK to finish his degree. Financially, sort of the longer he was around, the more costs he was incurring. So he was actually able to go back to Canada a couple of weeks before his placement finished. He'd done lots of hand-on in the early phases, and then everything he did, leading classes, assessments, he did from his front room in Canada. So it's so much more inclusive, and that's something really that we found very beneficial. We'd never have managed that previously, so we really can sort of help many more students that way. So that's something we definitely like in. So I've just got the chat box over the screen, so I'm just relocating that. The students as well seem much better prepared for the world of work that we meet in. As we said, they're much more independent, but when we look at what's been happening in healthcare, lots of areas are now suddenly adapting digital options, whether it's telehealth, monitoring of patients, whether it's education, appointments, all those things that are offered on an online setting. The students are getting first-hand experience of that, and not only of seeing it in action, but actually being involved in sort of the practical aspect of us setting it up, which really, if you can sort of be there at the forefront and involved in the setting up of these activities, they're going to be much more adaptable in the workplace with the experience they've gained, which is really important. There's so many positives that certainly this blended approach we'd be continuing longer term, even when face-to-face is a lot more available. I think certainly there's a few things we need to sort of change and sort of work on, and that's what we'll look at currently under challenges. But overall, the improvements, really, the benefits have sort of outweighed the challenges, really. So with regards to challenges, then certainly there have been some. And this is not only for the sort of the patients, sorry, not only for the students, but also for the staff. So I think the last figure I heard, so it may not be 100% accurate at the moment, but there was a lack of over 350 placements sort of across the area we're in. And that's a lot of students who, if they don't actually get their clinical hours, won't actually be able to graduate at the end of the year. So for the students that have had very altered university experience, people that have actually gone to university planning on sort of having a good time, they've gone into sort of a university at a time where they're not allowed to mix much with other people. It's not the university experience at all that they're expecting. Some of the, as a result of that, really are feeling that they've sort of had a bit of a raw deal. So the more we can actually do to facilitate placements to get people sort of finishing on time is definitely something that we're sort of aiming to do. There's only so much capacity within each area, and as it was mentioned earlier, staff are sort of exhausted after the year they've been through, redeployments, working in different areas, lots and lots of sort of factors, really. So the ways we've actually adapted, we could actually support more patients, sorry, more students than previous, and so much so that in a moment of madness, I think I can only class it as, the university recently wanted to have a look at different student models, because we normally have 2 students to 1 educator, though as I've got some new staff in my department, invariably it's been sort of the 2 of us supporting the students while I'm actually supporting my team member to sort of get up to speed with students and sort of support them so they're able to later on take students by themselves. But they actually wanted to try a 6-to-1 model, which we're actually discussing next week, and it's something we actually think, because of what we've learned in this last year, we actually probably won't be able to manage. Obviously juggling the sort of practical side, the hands-on space, all those factors is something we're looking at, maybe using university facilities over the summer, because they have empty facilities, but equally they have lots of students that have missed out. So that's something which we're going to have a look at. As I said, the challenge lots of the time is actually for my team as well, finding their feet in this virtual world. Sort of Microsoft Teams appeared, there was 1 or 2 intro sessions that were run, but at the time the staff were off, sort of being redeployed, and they came back to a service that is nothing like they remember or ever expected to find themselves in. And also students go to university expecting everything to be very hands-on. You think of physiotherapy as a very hands-on profession, and that's changed as well. So that's something which they're sort of adapting to, as we were in the earlier days. What we've really learned is the preparation side in advance is essential. We need to get the students sort of onboarded through our learning and development teams and recruitment so that they can start their placements. Their sort of all their OCCI health clearances come through. They can just enter the working place literally from the first day, with all the sort of spacing required, making sure we've got pod systems, patients aren't mixing, links for all the different virtual activity. Everything takes so much longer at the moment, so it really is important that they have every sort of moment of time they can face to face, alongside all the other options we've got. We need to make sure their IT set up in advance, they've done their online information governance training, so they'll have access virtually when they're sat at home to obviously patient information, and all that. The preparation in advance is immense, really. So we even get them set up on sort of the Trust's Learn Now system, so they can actually do that literally on day one, so they can hit the ground running. Challenges we have had as well is obviously there was a severe lack of laptops within the Trust. Although further orders have come through, it's challenging to get all the staff that need them to have access. So certainly there hasn't been any extra IT available for students. They've had to use their own laptops when remoting into the Trust. Most of the time that's been fine, but we have had 1 or 2 students really struggle with the Wi-Fi access because it's not the greatest in the university accommodation at our local university. Obviously, for some activities, it's not such a problem, but when they're leading a live exercise class, it really has caused challenges. So that is something that we have had to be mindful of. And after sort of realising that quite early on, we've then had discussions with the university about if they're on site, could they potentially go and use sort of rooms that aren't actually being used, because lots of the teaching's virtual, so they have more of a secure access. So we've had to sort of think about that, which is something we wouldn't have had to have worried about previously. Again, it's sort of ensuring it's inclusive as possible. We have had some students who have sort of hearing difficulties, so we have to make sure that they're able to engage fully with online activities. And equally in sort of a face-to-face setting, I don't know if some of you are working sort of face-to-face and wearing your masks day to day. Even my team who don't have any challenges with their hearing really have noticed that if people have got a face mask on and you're just not concentrating, without seeing someone's face and being able to see their lips move, you're struggling to understand what they're saying. That's something we never have thought of previously. So if we're struggling, we had one sort of student who did have a hearing aid, and we did have to really sort of be mindful of that and make sure that at all times he was able to sort of participate fully in his placement, and he was, with minor adaptations, but it was something we had to be mindful of really. And if we had students that didn't have access to Wi-Fi, that's something we'd have to sort of ask of the university arrange, because later on when there's less social distancing we would be able to bring somebody on site at all times. But at the minute that's just, I'm afraid, not the world we're living in, when we have a limited number of PCs and every single office door has a maximum number on it. And also now we've got things set up relatively smoothly because we've had so many students over the last little while, but initially to sort of get approval for the students to have access remotely so they could actually access patient data, lots of discussions with information governance, IT, there's lots of things we've had to sort of really work towards and sort of establish stronger links to support the students. And certainly listening to the earlier talks today has been really interesting, and there's things I'm thinking about going forwards maybe we need to link to further to help for the students. And some of the online learning we've done through sort of our mandatory training, use of simulation, particularly I did the ILS last week, and the face-to-face aspect of that, I think there's a lot we can actually learn from that and actually look at going forwards the placements to really make sure the students are getting the best sort of placement experience that they can. You would have seen a couple of students on the first page, and one of them was Alice, and Alice very kindly agreed to record a short video. We didn't have to bribe her, bless her. She'd finished a placement, she'd had a grade by this point, so she didn't feel obligated to do it, but she's just sort of talking just for a very short while as to her experiences, because she was probably the 4th or 5th student that came through with this blended method. So I'm just going to try and play it now for you, and hopefully if as it plays there's no audio, someone can just pop me a little message in the chat box, okay?
Hi there, my name is Alice and I'm a third year physiotherapy student from Brunel University, London. I've just finished a blended learning approach placement at Harefield Hospital with the cardiac rehab team. And in terms of what I found useful about the virtual part was that I was able to challenge and adapt my communication skills to overcome the virtual barriers of not being hands-on, which was definitely a challenge, but a good one. In terms of what I found not so good was that I often ran into technical difficulties, not only with accessing the patient information remotely, but the technical difficulties with the patient, such as Wi-Fi and not having the technology, that was definitely a challenge as well. I'd say also the fact that you don't get as much manual therapy practice is definitely a limitation, as well as physiotherapy is definitely a lot of hands-on a lot of the time. In terms of what I think is key for the blended learning programs going forward, I think as long as you're providing enough support for the student, it's definitely worth doing, with things such as laptops or headphones or whatever is needed for them, and also sort of ensuring the student has the learning materials and the patient notes to access ready for their virtual sessions from home. I think that's super important as well, and also just ensuring it's not heavily weighted virtually, because having a mix of the two, a nice even mix, is definitely beneficial, as I was able to practice hands-on as well as my communication online. But yeah, that's what I thought.
And quite a few of the things Alice mentions there are things we've sort of been trying to sort of work on over the last little while. Unfortunately, the laptops is something that still hasn't been possible. In the ideal world, all of my team would have trust laptops, and that's something which obviously all trusts are sort of looking at, because IT equally found themselves with everything changing overnight and everything needed adapting. Alice unfortunately was one of the students that did have challenges with the Wi-Fi, and the university have sort of since looked at options available. But overall, I think we sort of try, each student we've had, we'll sort of get feedback, and definitely the sort of hands-on. I think particularly in the earlier weeks, we've tried to weight it a little bit more to the face-to-face, whilst the sort of students are adapting and getting familiar with the environment. We also make sure that the team sort of quite sort of varied. We've got physiotherapists, exercise physiologists, exercise instructors, nurses, rehab assistant, and for those that haven't been able to come on site in the first week due to self-isolating or whatever, we sort of plan specific time where they can meet members of the team. But I think certainly earlier on we sort of try and have it a little bit heavier on the face-to-face side, and then later on the students don't mind the virtual aspect as much, and certainly for some it's been quite invaluable, such as a student that was able to go home to Canada and actually complete his placement, despite the fact that obviously he wasn't sort of just down the road as he was in the earlier weeks of his placement. Before I finish and sort of answer any questions that there are, then I thought it was sort of be a good opportunity just to sort of mention briefly, sort of going forwards, are we planning on remaining with blended placements? Are we thinking of going back fully face-to-face? And hopefully some of the things that we learned that might be beneficial as well. Obviously we work in a very different environment, but we're sort of looking at sort of getting these students ready to qualify and become sort of the future workforce, whereas lots of you are working more with the future, sort of the actual workforce, and working in very difficult conditions, as we all are. So something that I was thinking about previously was sort of more simulation training, because certainly when we did our ILS training last week, the practical side, the hands-on for that, obviously you can't really teach that in DFib skills over online learning, though lots of the learning, the pre-part was online, and I think that sort of blended approach worked very nicely. So for the students, more scenarios and sort of doing something similar there in the earlier weeks, I think, to get things on track, because we'd have more space in that venue to actually go through a lot more practical than in a gym where there's sort of patients and only set number of staff allowed. And also different models of education. So we've had 2 students at a time. At one time we had 3 students overlapping, and we're actually looking at sort of potentially 6 at a time going forwards, because of the flexibility between the different arms of the service. We could have some doing face-to-face while others did virtual, and it really does open up options which we wouldn't have had pre-COVID. Things that we've learned that I was, from my mind, thinking might be useful for your setting, but obviously you know much better yourselves the settings you're in, is that we've really had to increase the preparation before placement. Beforehand, students turned up, we started their induction and going through the different procedures, but now we need to make sure that all the paperwork's done in advance, the IT access is there, They're set up with a lateral flow testing, lots of different aspects that we didn't have to think about pre-COVID. So we do need to prepare more in advance, but then it tends to pay off later on, really. The staff themselves have needed a lot of support. So as well as supporting the students with the IT, then getting support from my team has been sort of invaluable, really, and having to sort of offer that in the earlier days, sort of run that support, sort of finding my way as I went. Obviously, where lots of people have been sort of thrown into doing things digitally, I think, was it Will that was saying there was sort of like a digital team and a face-to-face team, and lots of people's roles changed overnight. The more flexible the options, the more options available. Certainly that's been very beneficial, because not only does it help the students get more of a rounded placement, but actually if suddenly people are having to self-isolate, quarantine, now some travel's allowed, it does give us a lot more options. So if people are then suddenly not able to come on site, it doesn't necessarily mean that their placement won't continue there. Ping there to remind me, so luckily on the last slide. Equally, I think what has been invaluable is that although we have a plan as to how the placement is going to run, we've been able to adapt it. So some students that really do find the hands-on and the practical side really beneficial, they've actually been able to do a little bit more hands-on, whereas other people that sort of have flourished with the virtual as well, some of them, they've actually sort of done a little bit more virtually. So we have had that sort of options available there. Certainly the more active we've made the learning, the more beneficial it has been, and that is something which we certainly would continue, rather than us just feeding them information they've had already, by actually getting them more involved, case study discussions, working with each other. That really has been very beneficial, and they actually do tend to sort of find it much easier to relate it to practice when they've got a patient in front of them with a ventricular assist device, say, than if we just sort of literally read out information for an hour on the subject. So that has been really useful. The skills they've learnt will be able to transfer to many other settings, because lots of placements going forwards, musculoskeletal, lots of fields are working virtually, so they'll have got virtual skills when they actually enter the workforce that will be invaluable. They'll be familiar with the processes in the workplace, because they've had to do mandatory training like ourselves, and particularly like with the information governance side of things. Certainly it's improved the communication between ourselves and the university. They'd come and visit students once during their placement, but there's much stronger links now, and I think that helps both ways. I've done some lectures for them at the university. They're approaching us about different learning models, and can we take extra students, because they've got so many students that are at risk of not qualifying. So that communication, the students as well getting feedback from them, that really has been sort of invaluable, really. And even when communicating with the university, we presumed they understood what we meant by a placement model, and then we had to comment, oh, they only spend one day on site at the hospital, but hadn't realised the skills they're learning there are the exact same as they're using when they're in our community venues. It's exactly the same, just a different physical space, and also the same as on the online session. So it was sort of making sure that they understood fully as well. The only one challenge that we presumed that most students would realise, that when they're in the sort of virtual world, it was a very similar setting, the same standards were expected as when they were face to face. And then a student turned up to the objective setting meeting with myself and a colleague in their pyjamas. So we did realise that, sort of make it clear from the start, even in the virtual world, we expect you to be there in uniform. You're not turning up to patient appointments with sort of baseball caps on and things like that. But minor little thing really, and it's something that sort of we hadn't really thought of, and literally everything's just sort of adapting as we go, and it's worked really well for our students. I hope some of the things that we've sort of tried or sort of discovered may be sort of helpful in some way, and more than happy to answer any queries if people have got them. Let me try and close this screen share down. Okay. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Heather. I'm Mary, and I work at Merseycare Foundation Trust in Liverpool. So I posted a question about the use of simulation, and you've sort of touched on it as you were going through that presentation. I think you said ILS you'd used it for, hadn't you?
That's right, yes. Last week we
Yeah,
the other end of the learning spectrum, rather than for the students, we actually were the students. And
yeah, yeah.
I think
Yeah, so we're doing a piece of work, working quite closely with one of our universities, Liverpool John Moores University, because they've just got a brand new suite built, purpose-built simulation centre. They've got something like over 2,000 pieces of kit, three floors of you know, purpose-built, what look like ward environments. So it looks amazing actually what they've got on offer. But they were telling us that they used it for the first time quite recently for a 3-month period for first year student nurses to replace real life sort of placements. And they're doing an evaluation of that at the moment to measure the impact on those services when the students do go back out into clinical practice areas. Actually, are they more equipped, more skilled, have more expertise than would be expected of a student at that level? So it'd be really interesting, won't it, to see the outcomes from that evaluation. I think that will be really telling.
definitely. And I think obviously there are only so many people that you can sort of have in one space at a time due to COVID. So to make sure everyone gets the same opportunities, then that certainly sounds invaluable. I know within our trust, from sort of like the ITU setting, so the practical practice, so sort of lots of the different sort of manual techniques for the doctors, for nurses, physios, they have got sort of simulation dolls they can actually use in that setting, and they are using those. And certainly, although probably a stationary simulation doll from a cardiac rehab setting may not be exactly identical, we've certainly tried to get, well, more live simulation. So we've had some past patients obviously that have been happy to hang around, or maybe a patient after class, just sort of be sort of a guinea pig really, where they sort of try out different things, obviously with all the sort of the PPE and spacing and that side of things. And the students certainly found that very useful. So it'd be really interesting to hear how sort of it goes really. I suppose we'd have to have our patients sort of model the different exercises, and because obviously when they're looking at sort of the patients with exercise, then obviously that is but definitely something which was sort of thought of more so recently, sort of preparing for this, because as Will was saying, you rarely stop to sort of pause and think really. And we, until sort of we were asked could we manage 6 students, and I was sort of approached with regards to this, it wasn't something we'd really had a lot of time. We just sort of, every single student, we just changed things ever so slightly based on feedback from the previous, and in discussion with the sort of student that was with us really as to their past experiences and what they found beneficial. Because lots of the students came to us having done a placement which literally became a COVID placement. They're on general wards. The mine's done respiratory, but lots of other centres stopped taking students. So their experience, whereas when I qualified, and even up until just before, they'd have 5 or 6 really varied placements. Some of them had done 3 musculoskeletal placements, and that was literally it. So it's just really trying to adapt things, but it'd be really interesting to hear the outcome of that.
No, thanks for your presentation. It's really interesting.
You're welcome. Thank you.